You're listening to
Killer Communications,
brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons,
DNA ID,
Campus Killings, Scene of the Crime,
Zodiac Speaking,
and
Beyond Bizarre True Crime.
All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
Three days after 14-year-old Margaret Ellen Fox disappeared from a bus stop in New Jersey, her parents received a chilling phone call. $10,000 might be a lot of bread, but your daughter's life is the butter topping. Though investigators spent years trying to ID this caller, Margaret's abductor has never been brought to justice. But why would anyone want to ransom an innocent teenager? Though perhaps a more important question to ask is, why in particular was that teenager Margaret Ellen Fox? Chapter 1. The Babysitting Job. In the summer of 1974, Margaret was a recent 8th grade graduate in need of some extra allowance money. Margaret's desire to start horseback riding lessons and have some trendy new clothing to start high school with wasn't something her parents could afford. While her father made a good living as a plumber in the small New Jersey town of Burlington, 30 minutes away from Philadelphia, the family budget was tight. Even at 14, Margaret understood this and asked her parents if she could place an ad in the paper for a babysitting position. This way, she wouldn't have to worry about the family budget. Her money would be her own to pay for whatever she needed. Though her parents weren't keen on placing a public ad, Margaret was a responsible child with a lot of experience looking after her younger siblings, and as she'd be entering high school in the fall, it wouldn't be a bad thing for her to start learning how to make her way in the world. So Margaret and her cousin Lynn pooled their allowance money to pay for an ad in the local paper, the Burlington County Times. On June 18, 1974, their ad went public, simply stating, "Babysitters, experienced teenage girls, love kids, work at your house, call us." Only one day later, Lynn got a call from the ad. A man named John Marshall was interested in hiring her. He told her that he lived in Mount Holly, the next town over from Burlington, and had a 5-year-old son who needed care between 9:30 a.m. and 1:30 p.m. 5 days a week. He offered Lynn $40 a week, the equivalent of about $260 in today's money, as well as fare for the bus to take her from Burlington to Mount Holly, which was about a 15-minute ride. He said that he or his wife would pick her up from the bus stop in Mount Holly and drive her back there at the end of her shift. He also told her that he had a pool and she was welcome to take his son swimming every day in it. The opportunity sounded perfect, but Lynn was only 11 years old, and her parents weren't comfortable with her taking a job that required a bus ride to another town. So Lynn told her cousin Margaret about the offer, and she was ecstatic. $40 a week would go a long way to pay for new school clothes. But like Lynn's parents, the Foxes had some reservations about their daughter babysitting in the next town over. So Mr. Fox called this John Marshall and spoke for over an hour about the requirements of the babysitting job. Everything seemed above board, and Margaret was approved to start babysitting for the Marshalls. Just a personal side note here. I grew up in South Jersey, and I worked and had family in both Burlington and Mount Holly. And while I was only 3 years old in 1974 when this case unfolded, later when I got older, the story would impact me when I realized that something sinister could happen so close to where I grew up. Chapter 2. The Bus Stop. While she was excited to get started, Margaret was disappointed to find out that her work with the Marshalls would be delayed. Her father had wanted her to meet with John in person before taking the position, but this meeting was canceled as John Marshall cited that his mother-in-law had passed away unexpectedly and he wouldn't be able to meet before Margaret's first scheduled day of work on June 24th. While her father wanted to push the date back until they could have a meeting, John Marshall insisted it would be fine, and he told the Foxes that his wife would pick up Margaret from the bus station on the morning of the 24th and drive her back in the afternoon. He said that Margaret would know her by her red Volkswagen. While the Foxes weren't happy about not meeting with Mr. Marshall before the first day of employment, Margaret couldn't wait. On the morning of June 24th, she got up early and dressed to impress with a light blue floral blouse, maroon jeans, and a fun white and black checkered jacket, along with her usual hexagon glasses. She threw her bathing suit in a duffel bag and strapped on a pair of brown leather sandals. Her younger brother walked her to the bus stop 2 blocks from the Foxes' home at around 8:30 a.m., and the bus arrived on time 15 minutes later. Margaret shouldered her swim bag, waved goodbye to her brother, and boarded the bus. It was the last time her family ever saw her. Chapter 3. The Wrong Phone. Mrs. Fox sat near the phone at 10 a.m. on June 24th, waiting for Margaret to call and say she'd safely arrived at the Marshalls' home. But the phone never rang. It was unnerving, but Mrs. Fox also knew how excited Margaret had been and tried to tell herself that her daughter had forgotten to call in the bustle of taking care of the Marshalls' little boy. In her mind, she thought they'd probably gone right to the pool. But when 3 p.m. came and went without Margaret's return, Mrs. Fox knew something was very wrong. She called the phone number she had for John Marshall to find out why her daughter was late, but no one picked up. The phone just rang and rang and rang. She hung up and tried the number again, but once again it just rang. She tried a third time, and someone finally picked up. But it wasn't John Marshall. The voice on the other end of the line told her that she was calling a payphone outside the Lumberton grocery store on Route 38, about 2 miles away from the Mount Holly bus stop. The only John Marshall they knew worked at the grocery store, but he hadn't hired any teenage babysitters. I mentioned earlier that I had lived and worked in the areas we're talking about. In fact, I once worked right next door to that Lumberton grocery store payphone, which makes this case hit even closer to home for me. Chapter 4. The Search for Margaret. The Foxes immediately reported Margaret missing to the Burlington Police Department, and while police began the search process, the Foxes went out on their own to look for their daughter. But where to even begin searching was difficult. This John Marshall had never given the Foxes a physical address for his home. Their only avenue was going to the Mount Holly bus stop and to hope to find Margaret herself or some of her belongings. And while they did find a few eyewitnesses who claimed to have seen Margaret get off the bus at the Mount Holly bus stop, no one that they talked to ever heard of John Marshall. The Foxes returned home, sick with worry, but hoping that Margaret had just gotten delayed by something and would be coming home that night, but she was still missing the following morning. Over the course of the next 24 hours, police released hundreds of missing persons flyers with Margaret's picture and a description of what she'd been wearing. They also dispatched detectives to hunt down the eyewitnesses from the bus stop to gather more information. Through interviews, they were able to confirm that Margaret had ridden the bus from the Burlington stop to Mount Holly. She disembarked around 9:30 a.m. at the corner of Mill and High Street, acting happy and excited. After exiting the bus, several witnesses saw her talking to a man in a red Volkswagen, which was the car John Marshall had told her to look out for. But none of the witnesses could recall if she'd got into the car and left with him. Investigators scoured the Mount Holly area for anyone named John Marshall. They started with the grocery store employee by that name, and he had an airtight alibi and later passed several polygraph tests, so he was dismissed as a suspect. As they continued searching, they found an overabundance of men with the name John Marshall, or a derivative of that name in the area. This discovery, coupled with the fact that the phone number the Foxes had been using to contact him was a payphone, led police to believe that whoever had coerced Margaret into the babysitting job had created a false identity in the hopes of framing someone else. With no real name, no physical address or phone number, and none of Margaret's personal belongings to be found, detectives had no leads besides the red Volkswagen. By day 3 of the investigation, Burlington police were out of resources, so they brought in the FBI and contacted news stations to bring more attention to Margaret's case. Chapter 5. Ransom. The local papers ran a front-page story about Margaret's disappearance, while the FBI hooked up a recording device to the Fox's phone line. Investigators hoped that if Margaret had been taken for ransom, they would be able to trace whatever calls came in demanding money from her family. And only hours after the device was installed, the Foxes received a chilling phone call. On the evening of June 28th, a male voice came over the line stating, $10,000 is a lot of bread, but your daughter's life is the buttered topping. Mrs. Fox demanded to know the name of the caller, but he hung up, and the interaction was too short for the FBI to trace. But as terrifying as this threat was, it meant investigators were right, and Margaret was being held hostage someplace. There was a high likelihood that the ransomer would call again, allowing the FBI to find them. But there was no second phone call. Instead, over the next 2 days, the Foxes received letters in the mail with a typed message restating the threat about money and bread. The Foxes went to the bank and gathered the $10,000 to get Margaret back. When they returned home, another letter was waiting for them. But this time, the tenses and the grammar had changed. Instead of $10,000 is a lot of bread, the letter stated $10,000 was a lot of bread, and her daughter's life was the butter topping. This letter was signed so long again, with each word capitalized. No calls or letters came after this, leaving the Foxes heartbroken. They wouldn't be getting Margaret back for ransom. Chapter 6. A quickly cooling case. Without the ransom angle, the Burlington Police Department and the FBI put in hundreds of hours tracking down every possible lead in Margaret's case, and only 2 months after her disappearance, the FBI put out a sketch of a man they were seeking for questioning. Known to drive a red Volkswagen, their person of interest was described as a white male between the ages of 35 and 40, about 5 foot 10 inches tall and 200 to 230 pounds. He was said to have very blue eyes, light blonde or reddish hair, worn in a crew cut, with very noticeable even white teeth. Only a month prior to Margaret's disappearance, this same man had tried to pick up a teenage girl in his car. Some Mount Holly families also reported that their daughters had received calls about babysitting jobs from a man named John Marshall. Despite hundreds of leads coming in about the identity of this particular man, none were enough for police or the FBI to ever find him. Without any physical evidence, phone tracers were a suspect. The trail cooled quickly. But in 1975, a year after Margaret's disappearance, a convict named Charles Clobridge was arrested in Northtown, Pennsylvania, and in his interrogation, he claimed that he had murdered Margaret Fox. He told investigators he'd abducted her and then strangled her and thrown her body off a cliff in the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York. As the only potential break in a case that had been cold for a year, law enforcement threw all their effort into investigating this confession. Unfortunately for the Fox family, no body was recovered in the 72-hour search of the area Clobridge had claimed he disposed of Margaret. And even more unfortunate for the investigation, police determined that Clobridge had been sequestered in a hospital on the day of Margaret's disappearance. There was no way he was the perpetrator, and when confronted with this evidence, he admitted that he lied to get attention. The case went cold a second time, until 1977, when police took interest in a known sex offender who lived in the Mount Holly area around the time of Margaret's disappearance. He owned a red Volkswagen and seemed like the perfect suspect, but this man had a confirmed alibi and was quickly ruled out. 13 years passed without any leads, but in 1988, investigators got what they hoped would be a huge break. On December 10th, the skeletal remains of a teenage female were uncovered in New Jersey's Atlantic Highlands. With minimal forensic abilities at the time, the only thing investigators could do was have a composite sketch and a clay reconstruction created from the skull in the hopes that it would resemble Margaret. It took a decade before forensic technology was able to test the DNA of the bones. In 1998, the skeleton was found not to be a match for Margaret, and today, as of this recording, the remains are still unidentified. For over 40 years, there wasn't even a tip called in on Margaret's case. she had simply vanished off the face of the earth. In 2019, on the 45th anniversary of Margaret's disappearance, the FBI put out a $25,000 reward for information about Margaret's case, as well as releasing the ransom phone call to the public. With enhanced audio, the FBI is hoping that someone might recognize the voice of the ransomer. I'm going to play you the actual recording from that phone call. If anyone listening recognizes that voice, please call the authorities.
$10,000 might be a lot of bread, but your daughter's life is the buttered topping.
Who is it?
After releasing the ransom audio, the FBI did reportedly receive tips, but the case still remains under investigation, and no news has been announced on whether any of those tips will lead to the identity of Margaret's abductor. In the meantime, we can only speculate about Margaret's fate and who might have done her harm. Chapter 7. Theories and Speculations. The most widely accepted theory, and one that police share, is that Margaret was a targeted victim of stranger abduction. As several girls from the Mount Holly area had also received calls from a man looking for someone to babysit, it's entirely possible that whoever abducted Margaret was looking for an easy target, and when they saw her and her cousin's newspaper ad, it presented the right opportunity for them. This theory points to a calculated perpetrator who created an elaborate cover story that would trick both Margaret and her parents into thinking that she was taking a legitimate job. A subset of this theory would also suggest that Margaret may have been taken by someone who knew the area well. Police felt that this man knew the name John Marshall was a popular one in town and wouldn't be easily traced. And was it just a coincidence that a John Marshall worked inside the store next to the phone booth that the ransom caller had used? Police also felt that this caller knew the bus schedule, as well as other details of the area that were convincing enough to make Margaret's parents think John Marshall was a real person, but what his real name was a mystery. So what about the ransom call and the letters? There's been much speculation on why the Foxes never received any follow-up communication if Margaret had been abducted for money. The most prominent theory suggests that the ransom demands were not from Margaret's abductor at all. The communications to the Fox family only arrived after the media had picked up Margaret's story, meaning anyone had access to the details of her disappearance. And unfortunately for many missing persons cases, scammers will often contact families pretending to have information about their missing loved one. It's most likely that the calls and letters to the Fox home were a hoax, and this is why the FBI didn't release the call to the public for such a long time. But it is possible that Margaret's abductor was trying to ransom her, and something went wrong, which could account for the stop in communication. At the end of the day, we're left asking the same question: who took Margaret? Based on many similar missing persons cases, we can speculate that Margaret's abductor was a sexual predator, or possibly a serial murderer. Serial killers of the 1970s often used lures like babysitting jobs to ensnare victims, and there were many missing women cases around the time of Margaret's disappearance. At one point, investigators even seriously looked into Margaret being a victim of Ted Bundy, as he was known for luring young victims while driving a Volkswagen Beetle. But this theory was dropped after it was proven that Bundy was not anywhere close to New Jersey in the summer of 1974. But it's quite possible Margaret fell victim to a serial offender who still hasn't been caught. But without any tangible evidence, it's impossible for investigators to make any connections that might reveal a pattern. A more likely scenario is that her abductor was a local sexual predator who murdered Margaret and disposed of her. Mount Holly, New Jersey is near the Pine Barrens, a densely wooded area of over 1 million acres of preserved forest, and has an infamous history of being used as body dumping ground. In the 1960s and 70s, an average of 1 body a year was discovered in the Pine Barrens' dense undergrowth. And while most of these bodies have been attributed to victims of organized crime, it wouldn't be far-fetched to speculate that Margaret's murderer may have buried her there too. But without having a very specific area to start looking in, it would be almost impossible for law enforcement to search for Margaret in the Pine Barrens. I should point out too that in the immediate area where Margaret went missing from, there are several large bodies of water, creeks, swampy areas, and rivers. The fact that Margaret's body has never been found fills many with hope that she might still be alive out there. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children recently released an age-progressed photo of Margaret, showing her as what she might look like today at age 65. Though if she still is alive, there's speculation about why she hadn't returned to her family at some point. By all accounts, she was incredibly close with her parents and had never shown any proclivity for running away or wanting to escape her situation. A much more likely scenario is that Margaret has been deceased since her kidnapping in 1974, and whoever is responsible for her death has evaded justice for over 5 decades. Margaret's parents both passed away without knowing what happened to their daughter, though her siblings are still hoping for answers, along with Burlington law enforcement and the FBI. But after so long, is closure even possible in Margaret's case? In 2022, Burlington's police chief John Fine told Patch.com that Margaret's case poses unique investigative challenges. With the passage of so much time, many people who may have been potential suspects or witnesses have long since passed away, and law enforcement can no longer interview them. It's even likely that her abductor has died too, and if he's alive, he'd likely be very old. Investigators' best hope is that someone might recognize the voice on the ransom call that will generate a lead. Even if Margaret's killer has died, knowing who he was may help bring peace to her family and to the town of Burlington itself. While Chief Fine describes Margaret's disappearance as one of the biggest unhealed wounds in our community, her case was part of a larger impact on our national culture of children's safety. Chapter 8. The Rise of Stranger Danger. While stranger abductions only make up 28% of all kidnapping cases, stories like Margaret Ellen Fox's caused panic in the general public. Though Margaret's case only caused panic in her local area, there were several high-profile stranger abductions throughout the 1970s and 80s that helped fuel a new culture of stranger danger. Defined as a warning to children that any adult they do not know is potentially dangerous, stranger danger took hold of the American public most notably after the disappearance of 6-year-old Eaton Patz in 1979. After his mother watched him leave their Manhattan apartment to walk to his bus stop, 2 blocks away where his friend's mother was waiting for him, Eaton disappeared and was never seen again. His case was one of the most nationally covered missing child stories in American history, prompting the Missing Children Milk Carton campaign of the early 1980s, and the establishment of a Missing and Exploited Children Task Force in 1984. By 1982, Eaton's story was still high on mass news media lists, and CBS's Evening News ran a special citing that over 50,000 American children were kidnapped by strangers annually. While these numbers were incredibly inflated and untrue, the mass hysteria the special created perpetrated child safety PSAs about stranger danger well into the 2000s, and are often still taught to children to this day. Stranger danger tenets include not speaking to adults a child doesn't know, refusing to take anything offered by a stranger, including sweets, gifts, or drinks, never getting into a stranger's vehicle, never believing a stranger who says a child's parent has been hurt or in an accident, and never communicating with strangers through text, email, or on the phone. While the stranger danger concept has come under scrutiny in the past decade, there's been a decline in childhood stranger abductions since the 1980s. Some of this decline may be due to the enhanced surveillance and cell phone tracking being a deterrent to would-be abductors. But the cultural changes caused by the stranger danger concept may be more at play than people realize. Since its inception, parents are less likely to let their children go anywhere without a trusted guardian, and fewer parents in previous decades let their children walk to school, or even around their neighborhoods. And in the year 2025, would any responsible parent even consider letting their child go to a babysitting job in another town for someone they'd never met? It's very unlikely. Please don't mistake this as me victim blaming or victim shaming Margaret's parents in her case. They lived in a different time when people were more trusting and things like this didn't happen a lot in small towns. And I'm sure if they had any inkling that Margaret was in danger, they never would have let her go. In the 2000s, children weren't often seen outside at all without a guardian, even in their own yards. and instances of stranger abductions have become exceedingly rare. The U.S. Department of Justice currently notes that 99% of all child abductions are performed by their own family members. But for however successful or unsuccessful stranger danger may have been to childhood abduction prevention, none of it would have helped Margaret Fox. Her parents tried to do their due diligence and vetted John Marshall before allowing their daughter to babysit at a stranger's home. In essence, John Marshall was not a stranger to Margaret, but unfortunately for her, he wasn't real either. Whoever John Marshall truly is, he abducted a young girl on the brink of her whole life and left her family to grieve her disappearance for over 5 decades. But perhaps someday, we'll find out who he is and why he took Margaret, and then maybe find out what happened to her. Chapter 9. The Open Case. Margaret Fox's case is still open and active. The FBI is still hoping for a break that will bring answers to the Fox family and lay Margaret's memory to rest. If our listeners recognize the voice in the phone recording we played, or have any information they think would be useful in this case, we urge you to contact the FBI's Newark headquarters at 973-792-3000 or the Burlington, New Jersey Police Department at 609-386-3300. Audience invitation. Is there a case or an unexplained communication you'd like us to cover? Please take the time to rate and review the show, and in your comments, tell us what case you'd like us to tackle. You can also follow us and reach us on social media. We're on x.com at KillerCPod, and on Facebook at facebook.com/KillerCommunicationsPodcast. And be sure to check out our website, KillerCommunicationspodcast.com. Killer Communications listeners, if you want to support this show and get access to things like ad-free listening, early release episodes, and any bonus content, consider supporting us with an AbJack Insider subscription through Apple Podcasts. For $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year, your AbJack Insider subscription will not only unlock all these great benefits for this show, but for every podcast on the AbJack network of indie podcasts. Get your AbJack Insider subscription started with a free trial. Simply head over to Apple Podcasts and search for AbJack Entertainment, and you'll find the option to set up and unlock your subscription and start enjoying all the benefits of being a subscriber. We'll also include a link in the show notes. Your support is greatly appreciated. Just a heads up, new episodes of Killer Communications air every other Saturday. Thanks for listening, and we hope you'll join us on the next episode of Killer Communications.
Killer Communications is narrated and produced by Mike Morford for AbJack Entertainment. It's researched and written by Abigail Belcastro. Be sure to visit the show's website, KillerCommunicationspodcast.com, for past episodes, social media links, show news, and more.